All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Dunk on AP podcast. Today we were talking about life in the early colonies and the transatlantic slave trade. So, a couple of important things to get started here. All the British colonies participated to varying degrees in the Atlantic slave trade. And this was really due to the abundance of land and a growing European demand for colonial goods, most notably tobacco and cotton and things like that, as well as a shortage of indentured servants. Small New England farms used relatively few enslaved laborers. All port cities held significant minorities of enslaved people, and the emerging plantation systems of the Chesapeake and the southern Atlantic coast had large numbers of enslaved workers, while the great majority of enslaved Africans were sent to the West Indies. Now, a couple of terms to remember, kind of just getting started here. Mercantilism. This is the economic system practiced by European powers in the late 17th century, stating that economic self-sufficiency was crucial. As a result, colonial empires were really important for raw materials. Basically, you wanted to have as much of the world's natural resources as you could, as much as the world's gold and things like that, because it was so valuable and there was only a fixed amount of it. Now, the Salem witch trials in 1692. Some trials in Salem, Massachusetts, in which 19 women, were executed as witches. Hysteria, basically, up in Salem. The Navigation Acts of 1660, these were passed by Britain in their parliament, increasing the dependence of the colonies on the English for trade. These acts caused great resentments in the American colonies, but weren't super strictly enforced. And this was all part of a policy called salutary neglect, an unwritten, unofficial policy of the British government in practice from roughly the late 1600s to the mid 1700s that allowed its North American colonies to be left largely on their own with little British interference. So just remember salutary neglect. Whenever Britain starts to tighten that up, notably after 1754 to 1763 with the French and Indian War, when Britain starts to really put their thumb on the colonies, that is going to be when you see more movements toward the American Revolution. Don't forget, of course, the New England Confederation, because natives living in the 13 colonies were living around the 13 colonies were a constant threat to the New England colonies specifically and the other colonies really in general. Settlers really could expect no help from the home island of Britain because of a civil war that was going on there. So in 1643, Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, Connecticut, and New Haven formed a military alliance known as the New England Confederation. It had limited powers to deal with boundary disputes, the return of runaway servants, and dealings with American Indians. The alliance is going to end in 1684 when Britain starts paying more attention to the island. But this really was the first step in the colonists banding together toward a common cause, and they fought King Philip's War together. So now moving on to the triangular trade. This was the trade route originating in Europe that was used to supply colonies in the New World with slave labor and goods. So it's a term that describes the Atlantic trade routes between three different destinations in colonial times. The triangular trade route covered England, Europe, Africa, the Americas, and the West Indies. So the West Indies supplied slaves, sugar, molasses, and fruits to the American colonies. The most famous cargo moved in that group was slaves, but lots of things moved in this trade. So there is a difference between servitude and slavery. So indentured servants were men, women, and sometimes children from Great Britain. They signed a contract tying you to your master for 4 to 7 years. You could not get married or bear children in that time. The servants got passage from England, food, clothing, shelter, and sometimes a salary. The master, the indentured servant was their property. They could sell or transfer the rights of their servant. So indentured servants, if they were caught trying to escape, they were given a longer length of servitude. Permission from masters was required to leave the colony. Work for someone else was also, you needed permission for that, or if you to keep money for personal use. Approximately 1/2 of the European population that came to the colonies started as indentured servants. Up to around 90% of the population that settled in the Chesapeake area was really that. That's who that was. They were settling in that Chesapeake area. So the men typically were bricklayers, joiners, plasterers, cooks, clerks, gardeners, coachmen, butchers, blacksmiths, and musicians, whereas the women were typically performing domestic chores like laundry, sewing, and housekeeping. Big difference between indentured servitude and what will come to be called chattel slavery. So between the 1500s and the 1800s, millions of Africans were captured and shipped across the Atlantic Ocean, sold as slaves in the Americas. So slavery has existed in many parts of the world in its origin. People forced into slavery came from different walks of life. You had farmers, merchants, priests, soldiers, musicians, fathers and mothers, sons and daughters. The shortage of labor in the Americas leads to the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. You get the first ship over here in 1619, but it's not until after Bacon's Rebellion, a rebellion of former indentured servants who are moving west and keep running into issues with natives and don't feel that Virginia is supporting them, so they launch a rebellion led by a guy named Nathaniel Bacon. After that, Britain and the colonies say, you know what, importing these indentured servants isn't working so well. We should turn our attention more so to African slaves. European planters needed workers on sugar, and tobacco plantations, and of course cotton. So Native Americans had been enslaved at different points, but European diseases killed so many of them. Um, it's they're not ideal slaves for a number of reasons. African slaves were in the millions forcibly taken to the Americas. Most were from the west coast of Africa. Then some were exchanged for firearms and goods. Others were kidnapped on raids by traders in neighboring tribes. So the majority of slaves that are coming to the Americas from Africa are going either to the British West Indies, what we would call the modern day Caribbean, or Portuguese Brazil. 41% are going to the Caribbean, really, in Spanish America, the Spanish Caribbean, 15% are going there. The other Caribbean islands make up 41%. Portuguese Brazil makes up 37%. Europe and Asia, 2.5%. And British North America, what we would call really more so in the continental United States, they are about 4.5%. So, captured Africans became part of a network called the Triangular Trade. The first leg of the triangle, ships carried European goods to Africa to be exchanged for slaves. The second leg was the Middle Passage. Africans were brought to the Americas to be sold. This trip was famously terrible. The third leg was when American products were carried to Europe. Some slave traders from the Americas sailed directly to Africa, not following the triangular route. The process of getting slaves to the New World was called coffin packing, which ignored living conditions in the name of profits. Captive Africans were chained together, forced into dark, cramped quarters below the ship's decks. They could neither sit nor stand, and the journey lasted 3 to 6 weeks, with 10 to 20% not surviving the trip. Now, slave traders carried captive Africans throughout the Americas. For the Spanish, they worked at Caribbean sugar plantations. For the Portuguese, they were in Brazil. Then for the British, they were in the West Indies, but also to the colonies of North America. For England, they dominated the slave trade by the end of 1600s. So with jobs, most slaves worked on plantations. Others worked in mines or in towns or in the countryside. Skilled craft workers, carpenters, metalworkers, coopers, continued crafts in the Americas, and women were typically given domestic duties. Um, Slaves, as far as their living conditions, they had to meet their own basic needs at the end of the workday. The cooking, mending, and tending the sick fitted in really around work for the slaveholder. Um, then the living conditions were harsh, physical and degrading punishment inflicted for minor offenses. Many slaveholders lived in constant fear of rebellion by angry slaves who could no longer take harsh treatment they faced on the plantations. There were a number of slave revolts. In 1663, you have the first serious slave conspiracy in colonial America. A servant betrays a plot of white servants and Negro slaves in Gloucester County, Virginia. Then in 1712, there's a slave revolt in New York. This was April 7th. 9 whites were killed, 21 slaves were executed. 1730, there was a slave conspiracy discovered in Norfolk and Princess Anne counties in Virginia. Then 1739, the big one that you need to know, the Stono Rebellion. This was in Stono, South Carolina, September 9th. 25 whites were killed before the insurrection was put down. 1741, there was a series of suspicious fires and reports of a slave conspiracy that led to a hysteria in New York City. 31 slaves and 5 whites were executed. 1773, Massachusetts slaves petitioned the legislature for freedom on January 6th. There is a record of 8 petitions during the Revolutionary War period. So, how did slaves resist? Well, they had passive resistance and active resistance. Passive or day to day resistance was the most common form of opposition to slavery. They would break tools, they would pretend to be sick, they would stage slowdowns, they would commit acts of arson and sabotage. All of these are forms of resistance and expression of slaves' alienation from their masters. So, active resistance would be something more like running away, organizing, attacking your slave owner, or rebelling. As far as slave codes, remember, slaves during this time were considered property. Slaves had no rights or freedoms. Slaveholders controlled most conditions under which they lived. Often, enslaved people endured brutal treatment and abuse. They coped with inhumane conditions in many different ways. Some resisted by trying to keep their cultural traditions alive or their religion. Others turned to religion for strength and hope. Some were able to flee and establish communities of runaways, notably maroon societies, sometimes even in swamps. Now, effects of the slave trade. 400 years the Atlantic slave trade went on, and it devastated West African societies. There are estimates of 15 to 20 million Africans shipped to the Americas against their will. Millions more were sent to Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. The human cost was enormous here. Countless died in transit. Millions were deprived of freedom. Their descendants were doomed to lives of forced servitude. That's the difference in chattel slavery and indentured servitude, is that in chattel slavery, you are property for life, and so are your kids of your master, rather than indentured servitude, where you are in a contract for 4 to 7 years. Now, the effect on Africa, the effects were profound there. Slave raiders captured the strongest and youngest, the future leaders of these societies, and they divided Africans one from another. Some rulers waging wars to gain captives. And then forced labor of millions of Africans did not enrich Africa. By 1750, half of Virginia's population will be slaves. Two-thirds of Virginia's population, of South Carolina's population, will be slaves. Africans were the largest non-English immigrants. By 1775, slaves made up 20% of the U.S. population, with 90% of those living in the South. Now, the effect on the American economy. The forced labor of Africans does enrich the American economy, particularly the cotton economy, in the sugar economy in the South. The labor of African slaves helped build economies of many American colonies, not just the South, but the South is the big one because they needed the most labor. Their knowledge of agriculture contributed to the growth of the rice industry in southern English colonies, and that is the ugly history of the transatlantic slave trade. Let me know if you have any questions.